Hello and welcome to another episode of the UFOcast as Captain Scarlet. This time it's episode 11, Avalanche. And after the disappointment of last week, I was hoping for a good episode, and this is it. So this is the first of 4 episodes that I had on a VHS tape. I had volume 5 of the VHS run when I was a kid, which had Avalanche, The Heart of New York, Special Assignment, and The Trap on it, most of which we'll be coming to in the next few weeks. They're not in that order on the Blu-ray, as you will realise, but it means that this episode is particularly memorable, or one of a group of particularly memorable episodes for me. That might be why I still enjoy it, but I think it is a particularly good episode when compared with last week in particular. It's a nice, simple plot. There is action and suspense from the start. There is a genuine mystery to be solved, and that race against time to defeat the Mr. threat, which you get in the best Captain Scarlet episodes. Nice to see a story written by Shane Rimmer, better known as the voice of Scott Tracy. It is a good script. It's easy to pick holes in these things, and there are aspects of it where you go, hang on, does that make sense? Things like, why don't they just get an SPV from the off? But I suppose then you wouldn't have the sort of like, here's the pause in the middle of the story for them to find the local Spectrum agent and figure out where he's hidden his SPV. Those aspects are always quite fun. And there is the whole like, well, why when they're on red alert, do they let Eddie in? Like, do they not know that? Have they not been briefed? Let me back up a bit. So there's the ongoing question of who actually knows what, because there's that call between the General and Captain Colonel White about like, oh, we've heard this Mr. threat. There is that question of like, well, what do people outside Spectrum really know about the Mysterons? And what is the relationship between Spectrum and other military organisations, which is part of this episode, the sort of the comedy, the aspect of it, of Colonel White getting increasingly annoyed. And there's also the question of like, well, what does the world need these missiles for? In the absence of like the Mysterons, one assumes that these missile bases were set up before the Mr. threat. And I suppose I guess it's just a reflection of the fact that this was made in the 1960s, where the Cold War was still very much a live issue. And although Captain Scarlet takes place in a world in which there is a world government, you can kind of see the idea of like, well, maybe the fact there were missile bases are reflective of what was going on in the real world at the time. So that was just an interesting thought. But I really enjoy the snowy setting. Eddie's death at the beginning is particularly grim as he falls out of his truck as it collapses down the mountain and then gets buried in this snow. And I suppose this leads to an interesting question of, did the Mysterons cause the avalanche? Given that their plan involves him, did they make the threat and then go, right, who can we pick on to make this happen? Or did they seize upon the opportune moment of him dying in this avalanche to go, oh, well, Mysteron him, and then we'll make the threat? Because although the threat comes over the opening titles, it has to come over the opening titles because that's the format of the Captain Scarlet episode. You wonder what order the threat and the Mysteronization happen in. I'm overthinking this potentially. And Barry Gray's score is great. I mean, I think even if you have a Duff episode like we had last week, the music's always good. That's one thing that can be said for him. I will make a comment here about watching on Blu-ray, though I suspect this was something that I noticed on the DVD as well. The domes are not domes. They are clearly flat pieces of, I don't know, plywood maybe, wood, possibly even cardboard, I don't know. Anyway, they're very well painted. Certainly watching on Blu-ray, it's very clear that they're not actually domes, which makes sense. There's quite a lot of them. It would have been a big job for the model-making team, I suspect. It's no doubt a cost-cutting measure. And I guess also, if you have them made of something that's flat, you don't have to build a set that's anywhere near as deep. So again, you save money there. And I guess this is just one aspect of knowing that they were making this for television, that the people watching it were not going to be seeing it in anywhere near the resolution that they were filming it in. Further to that, everybody in the UK would have been watching it in black and white, or the vast majority of people would have been watching it in black and white. And so things like that just wouldn't have shown up. Certainly when I watched this as a kid on standard definition television in the 90s, I didn't notice that the domes weren't domes. I wonder if I could. Well, I don't have that VHS tape anymore. I wonder if I could watch it on VHS again, whether I would notice or not. And I suppose the other thing that Blu-ray really shows up, slightly to the detriment of the program, is when you cut from a wide model shot to the puppets, the little immobile figures that represent people in the model shot are very well. They're very obviously immobile. And then you cut to the puppet shot and they're moving. That's a lot more noticeable on the high definition Blu-ray than it would have been on standard definition broadcast or VHS. So although it's lovely to have these episodes pristinely restored, it does show up stuff that probably was not meant to be seen. One other thing I noticed this time, which again I don't know whether this is just an artifact of Blu-ray, is that when the Mistron truck is blown up at the end of the episode, you can see the explosive bag inside as it breaks apart just before it detonates. So again, things like that you might have got away with at a lower resolution, you just don't on Blu-ray. But that's a minor niggle, and I'm glad that we've got this episode in this resolution.
This week's Spectrum agent is Cliff Chapman.
Avalanche, I very much enjoyed. It looks absolutely stunning. This is the first time I'm seeing the Blu-ray remastered version, so it looks fantastic. A few slightly more obvious strings notwithstanding. I found the pace really pretty good. It generally errs on the side of building up tension and mystery rather than feeling particularly slow. Although there are some times when you can tell that they're just really milking the beautiful set design and beautiful model work. So I can kind of forgive it that. But it mostly builds very nicely. There's a little bit of repeated model work, I think, but that's fine. The themes are just incredibly adult feeling. You know, when you're a child, you watch it and you just think, this is the most adult show in the world. This is fantastic. This is amazing. How am I even allowed to watch this? It's so violent. So there's lots of guns. There are few punches pulled. I also quite liked Colonel White's development. There was a little characterization, rather. There was some nice sort of military might versus scientific investigation themes going on, which was mostly pretty subtle. They sort of spelled it out towards the end, you know, just in case anyone had missed it. But I thought that was very well done on the main. And it was really nice to see Lieutenant Green and Scarlet working together. That was very cool. So, yeah, a really enjoyable, great-looking episode.
And if you'd like to contribute to a future episode of the podcast, please visit ufocast.co.uk/captain to sign up.
So let's move on to the usual things that we're keeping track of. So episode order on DVD. This is really early on DVD. This was number 5 in the order on DVD. As an episode that involves a generic Mr. On threat, I suppose it can go anywhere, so that's fine. 16 on VHS, so a little bit further down the order. New Mr. On powers. Well, are there any new Mr. On powers in this episode? Possibly. We don't know if they cause the avalanche to happen. If they did, that's along the lines of like the chain that they move in Renegade Rocket, or are they just taking advantage of a natural phenomenon? We don't actually know. And then this is even more spurious. I've got creating things out of thin air, because where do the capsules come from that Eddie puts into the ventilation systems? One assumes that he wasn't carrying something like that in his truck. What would he use it for? I don't know. So there's the possibility that the Mistrons have somehow materialised something in their recreation. So is it a win or a loss for Spectrum? I'm going to say this one's a draw, actually, because although they do stop the threat, several bases of people die. So I'm going to say this is a draw. And if you head over to the website, you will find the Mistron Puppet Gallery, which we will add Eddie to this week. So that was Avalanche. Next week, we are going on to episode 12, Shadow of Fear.